to another episode on the series BIMSTEC, Perspectives and Potential of the Region, being brought out by the Avalog Initiative. On this particular episode, we're focusing on India. We've invited a guest speaker, Dr. Swaran Singh, who is a professor for diplomacy and disarmament at the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament at the School of International Studies of the Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. He is president of the Association of Asia Scholars, general secretary of the Indian Association of Asian and Pacific Studies. He's a guest professor at the Research Institute of Indian Ocean Economies, Yunnan University of Finance and Economics in China, and on the advisory board of the Atlanta-based Communities Without Borders. Professor Singh has 25 years of experience in research and training, and he has taught across India and also around the world, with numerous publications to his credit. Thank you so much, Professor, for taking time to join us on this particular episode, where we are focusing on BIMSTEC at a time where Sri Lanka is hosting the 5th BIMSTEC Summit, and we're looking at different perspectives, national perspectives from all BIMSTEC member states. If I were to ask you firstly, Professor, when you look at India and BIMSTEC, if you could highlight some of the main areas of interaction, what is BIMSTEC to India?
Thank you, George, first of all, for having me on your program. And compliments and congratulations to Sri Lanka for finally hosting the 5th BIMSTEC Summit this 30th of March. India, of course, is enormously interested in BIMSTEC, not just because it's a large country in terms of population, in terms of its economic size, but there are multiple ways that make BIMSTEC extremely critical for India to achieve its own objectives. Now, let me share with you 4 or 5 of them very quickly. First of all, India, you remember from 1990s, has focused on Look East and then Act East and now Act Far East policy. And that makes BIMSTEC a very important stepping stone for India to connect with the larger region through first connecting with its immediate region around Bay of Bengal. Second, of course, is a very interesting northeast region of India, which has had issues of development and security and restiveness. And that northeast region that is home for about 4% population of India and 8% of area actually shares boundaries with the 4 of the 7 BIMSTEC member nations. And a comfort level with these nations through BIMSTEC means a lot to build bridges, connectivity for this region and seek development of that region very clearly as India's own way of ensuring prosperity and integration of that region to the mainland India. And then, of course, the whole world is looking at maritime from continental perspectives, and that again makes these maritime littoral nations of the Bay of Bengal really relevant for India to how India wishes to move forward in building relationships and partnerships. 4th interesting area could be how SAARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, for about 5 years, I'm not going into the reasons, has become almost dysfunctional. And BIMSTEC also is sometimes called mini SAARC, because it has 4 of the SAARC nations in addition to 3 other nations, which makes it again very relevant. And I remember that in 2016, when India had hosted BRICS Summit meeting, the outreach summit was then organized with BIMSTEC national leaders. And in that sense, again, when in 2019, Indian Prime Minister had his second innings, he was being sworn in as India's Prime Minister for second time. Again, he chose to invite BIMSTEC leaders. So in that sense, multiple ways how BIMSTEC becomes very, very relevant for India to achieve its own objectives of economic development, of security, of foreign policy. And that is why we have seen that India's interest in BIMSTEC has enormously increased in last about 6-7 years. And though BIMSTEC, as you know, was created way back in 1997, stayed largely dormant for a long period of time. But now I think with this new consciousness of India, and of course reciprocated by other member nations of BIMSTEC, BIMSTEC is becoming far more active in several sectors that we can go and discuss in later part of our discussion. But India is clearly excited and feels very connected and engaged to moving forward and creating a momentum of BIMSTEC. And Sri Lanka is really contributing a great deal, whether it is online summit meetings or now offline summit meeting, which is where you see this hybrid model of, I think, Nepalese Prime Minister is going to come to Colombo. And likewise, some other leaders may be joining online. India's foreign minister is in Colombo. So I think India is really, India feels welcomed by these nations in building that close partnership across many sectors. And that makes BIMSTEC really a kind of a happening area, especially after they have now been able to establish their secretariat in Dhaka. The budget contributions are going on. India's own budget contribution has gone up. Efforts are being made to increase personnel also in the BIMSTEC secretariat. So I think there is a little positive spin and momentum that one notices in BIMSTEC happening. And this summit meeting in Colombo is really another inflection point in pushing that positive movement forward.
So if you go on to that point of moving forward, what do you see as some of the tangible measures that can be taken? What more should we be doing in BIMSTEC? We have now come over several decades. What more should we be doing to deepen integration, to become a formidable force for this region and hopefully play a bigger role on the world stage?
Two things, George, I would underline before I mention as to what are they achieving, what they're planning to achieve. One, as I mentioned, for a long time, for whatever reasons, BIMSTEC was not the focal point. So India, for example, had the BBI and sub-regional cooperation of Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, India. Separately, we had a bilateral arrangement with Sri Lanka, also certain kind of relationship with Myanmar and Thailand. But BIMSTEC as a collective was not kind of focused for several years until I said for last 7-8 years, it become a focus area. Second, more immediate period is the period of pandemic, which has seen all of these nations really struggling to deal with the health crisis, which also impacted their economies. But that also creates a background which then should now push them to build that connectivity and partnership as they seek resilience of their economic growth rates and development and anti-poverty programs, etc. So in that context, I think the summit meeting in Colombo itself is planning to initiate a whole lot of major efforts, which obviously have gone on in last several years into the making. And I think most important, I will say, is the launching of BIMSTEC Charter. And of course, their connectivity master plan of 2025. Then there's Convention on Mutual Legal Assistance in Criminal Matters, MOU on cooperation between diplomatic academies, both in training and sort of exchanges, MOU on an association on establishment of BIMSTEC's technology transfers facility, which is to be set up in Colombo. So one could go on mentioning several of these initiatives which are going to see the day of light in Colombo summit meeting. And that, of course, will push primarily their initiatives that have already been established. For example, already you see they have all ratified, they have set up the secretariat, they have ratified, as I mentioned, the BIMSTEC energy grid of interconnectivity, which is now to start and get implemented. They have also empowered their secretary generals to likewise also ratify the conference on cooperation, the Convention on Cooperation on Combating International Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and so on. So there are areas, one could even talk about negotiations on building a BIMSTEC development fund, BIMSTEC motor vehicles agreement, BIMSTEC coastal shipping cooperation agreement. So many areas where synergies have been built over a period of time. Some of them have already been initiated but have not picked up momentum and speed. Some of these have been now brought to a kind of a fruition and going to be launched in Colombo Summit. They have also obviously moved into majorly focusing on countering terrorism, crime, security, joint exercises, and so on. So there is a certain build-up of that groundswell, which I notice where all these nations of Bay of Bengal littoral have shown interest in building partnerships, primarily focusing on building their own connectivity. And I think this probably we are looking at the post-pandemic period now, and the 5th summit meeting in Colombo, I think should, as I say, would prove another inflection point in pushing that momentum forward already several of these initiatives are on the table. How they quickly will be implemented on the ground will be seen in coming times.
Thank you very much, Professor, for giving us insight, for looking at not only the national perspective of India and India's connectivity with BIMSTEC, but also sharing your expertise on what more could be done, where we could be going, what we should be achieving through this grouping. This is where, when we look at all of our member states, we all have a stake, a role to play in this grouping. We all have a contribution to make, and we should be looking at it from a national perspective, how we're going to increase that momentum, but also from a collective point of view, where we are trying very hard to see what we should be doing as a region, as a group, what is for the benefit of everyone. So thank you so much, Professor. Thank you for taking your time and for sharing your experience with us. We've been extremely honored to have you.
My pleasure, George, to be on your program, and I look forward to this program growing and becoming a really celebrated program online. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was Professor Swaran Singh from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, sharing the Indian national perspective, looking at it from an Indian lens as to how India views BIMSTEC, and also looking at the future, what we should be doing, where we should be going, how we can take tangible steps to make meaningful progress in BIMSTEC. Thank you for joining us on this episode of BIMSTEC, where we looked at the potential and we looked at perspectives from the region.